Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here tonight. I'm Andrea Morgan, and I'm the Research Associate in Painting and Sculpture of Europe here at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture on Canova's Modern Classics. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this evening's program, Emerson Bowyer and Lisa Çakmak. Emerson is the Searle Curator, Painting and Sculpture of Europe here at the Art Institute of Chicago. A specialist in 18th and 19th century French and British art, he has previously worked at the Frick Collection, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. His exhibitions include David d'Angers, Making the Modern Monument, Luminous Worlds, British Works on Paper, 1760 to 1900, and Lifelike, Sculpture, Color, and the Body, for which he was co-curator. Most recently, Emerson curated 2 exhibitions, one on Antonio Canova's clay sketches, which inspired tonight's talk, and one on the sculptural works of Camille Claudel. Prior to joining the Art Institute of Chicago in 2022 as chair of the Arts of the Ancient Mediterranean and Byzantium Department, Lisa Çakmak worked at the St. Louis Art Museum as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Associate Curator, overseeing tremendous changes to the museum's galleries, managing the reinstallation of the Greek and Roman art galleries, as well as the museum's Egyptian and numismatic collections. She initiated and realized the critically acclaimed Sunken Cities, Egypt's Lost Worlds in 2018, the largest grossing special exhibition in St. Louis in 25 years. Çakmak also has significant archaeological experience, having participated in excavations in Cyprus, Italy, Greece, and Israel. Since arriving at the Art Institute, Çakmak is currently overseeing a large-scale refresh of the Mary and Michael Chaharis galleries of Greek, Roman, and Byzantine art, and working on an exhibition of ancient Roman sculpture that will open in March of 2025. Now please join me in welcoming to the stage Emerson Bowyer and Lisa Çakmak.
Good evening. It's fun to be here in this sort of casual format. Lisa and I don't get to collaborate that often, so Canova, and this is the point of this discussion tonight, Canova has provided a place for our interest to
intersection.
So we're going to talk tonight about Canova's relationship to the art of antiquity, specifically ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Antonio Canova was the preeminent sculptor and artist, actually, of any medium in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He was highly sought after for his exquisitely finished marbles, and he was patronized by the rich and powerful of Europe and even America in one case. He was the foremost neoclassicist of his era, and by that we mean that he was part of a movement or style that emulated the antique and the style of the antique, the pure lines, the ideal forms of the art of ancient Greece and Rome. This is also a period that coincides with the birth of archeology.
Yeah, and so I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight, and it's fun to be able to hang out with Emerson, who not only is a colleague but a friend. So we can sort of pretend none of you are here and that we're just hanging out talking about art and Canova. Canova was sculpting in a really interesting moment in history. Maybe I'll advance to this next slide. Archaeology is a fairly newish discipline when you sit where I sit in the ancient world, and something new is, 1st century BCE. To me, that feels very new. And he was living in a really interesting moment where he was sort of part of this second wave of artists who was looking at antiquity, and rather than trying to take ancient fragments and restore them and repair them, he really was much more interested in observing and preserving and then kind of iterating. And he had great respect for antiquities. And as a result, he actively chose not to do a lot of restoration work, which is interesting because dating back to the 15th and 16th centuries, that is how a lot of sculptors, many of the famous sculptors, Bernini, Algardi, that's how they made their livings, was by preserving, restoring, repairing, and sometimes making these Frankenstein-like sculptures of ancient, that are drawing upon other ancient fragments. And Canova actively chose not to do that. He was also living in a time where the plaster cast was expanding and exploding, and that is how a lot of our knowledge of ancient sculptures came down to us, was not through the original, but through plaster casts.
So here, hang on. So here, for example, is Canova's, as part of the curriculum from the second half of the 17th century onwards, these sort of certain examples of antique sculpture became canonical precisely because of their reproduction as prints or in plaster casts, and students were taught to copy them, essentially, in order to not only master their craft, but to master the style of antiquity. And here is a great example, and it's the first terracotta we have by Canova, which is on the left, and that is his copy of a plaster cast of the ancient wrestlers. And it was part of a competition that he entered at the Venice Academy, and only got second for some reason. I can't really...
Hard to believe. But actually, when we look at the history of the Art Institute and antiquity at the Art Institute, this is a postcard from the Plaster Cast Gallery of Greek and Roman Antiquities. That's what the Art Institute was collecting originally as representative of antiquity. So we actually didn't start bringing authentic marble sculptures into the collection until much later. And sadly, many of these casts now have been destroyed. And I think plaster casts also play a little bit of a role in this misunderstanding that ancient sculptures were white, because plaster, if anyone's ever sort of interacted with plaster, it's very chalky and dusty and white. And they made these casts, they didn't paint them, they didn't do anything to the surface. And so when you have these sculptures being copied in plaster and disseminated throughout Europe and the Americas, it's very easy to see how people would think these sculptures were just white marble. But in actuality, they were painted, they were accessorized, sometimes they had holes for earrings, they had attachments for fillets. And I know Canova also used polychromy in his work.
Yeah, the first real studies of polychromy were happening in the late 18th century, and a lot of people sort of didn't want to hear about it because, of course, their ideal was the idea of white marble. But I think Canova was very interested, and he was known to tint some of his marbles after he completed them, often just a sort of pale yellowish color to give what would a kind of morbidezza or a feel of real flesh. And that was even in his time, that was a little scandalous. There's a great example of a work which is in the Hermitage now, his Ebe, for which we have a clay model in the exhibition. And you can see here that she is holding metallic objects. And originally, her skin was tinted a slight yellow. There was a sort of blush on the cheeks, a slight red across the lips. And people were horrified. And I think the commissioner of the object had it cleaned immediately. So, because he wanted it to be back to what he thought ancient marbles and contemporary art should look like, which was pure white.
And I think it's really interesting what sounds like what clearly to the patron was excessive use of color actually sounds very restrained. And I actually think that Canova's use of color really did a service to was based in what these ancient sculptures would have looked like. That not every single surface of an ancient marble sculpture would have been covered in a really bright blue or a really bright red. Sometimes you see these reproductions and they look a little paint by number, and the color can look very flat. But really, I think the polychromy of antiquity is enhancing the features, adding lipstick, adding blush, and of course, using brighter colors for clothing, accessories, borders. But people, they didn't have just yellow skin or red skin. They were able to apply the color in layers and to really, finesse it and modulate it. And so I wish we had a Canova in color.
Well, and it says a lot about what people thought antiquity should be. So there was a small minority of people who were against Canova sculptures because precisely of the fact that with all these elements, not just the tinting of the marbles, but also the meticulous way in which they were carved, in which different surfaces were made as close as possible to fabric or flesh or hair. There was something that was considered a little too sensuous about that, a little too close to real life. For most viewers, marble statues were meant to be on a plinth, separated from the viewer. They were meant to be beyond the realm of the everyday. And his sculptures seem to cross that boundary sometimes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I have a couple of slides here that just show, this is a sculpture in the Torlonia collection. And the head of this goat was restored by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So this is sort of this first generation of artists that I was talking about who really made a business of significantly enhancing and repairing ancient sculptures. And then we have this funny one also in the Torlonia collection. So this is made of 112 different pieces of sculpture.
From different sculptures.
Yes, from different sculptures. Some are ancient fragments, some are modern fragments to sort of fill in. But what this is illustrating and how this, is sort of preceding Canova and different from Canova is these works were intended to decorate palazzi and villas. Like this is a Piranesi's sketch of the Villa Albani in Rome, and here is a shot of one of the covered arcades of the villa. So you wanted to have a huge collection of complete sculptures to decorate your home. This was a sign of your wealth, it was a sign of status, and this is what was really desired in the 15th and 16th and early 17th centuries. And then you have this transition in the 18th century with the establishment of several museums, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vatican Museum the Vatican exists for a long time before that, but the museums really are sort of in the 18th century. That's sort of when the gallery that has Prima Porta Augustus, I can't remember what that one is called, but that's when that one is established. And so the museums, now you have this separation where once for antiquities, you had people who were decorating homes and establishing their status. Now you have museums collecting and going after antiquities, and they want something a little bit different. Now there's more reverence for the fragment. And that is sort of the environment that Canova is in. And Canova has some really interesting connections to antiquity, not just aesthetically and in terms of inspiration, but there's a lovely story about the Parthenon marbles in Canova.
So, there was this huge to-do when the Elgin marbles arrived in London because people hadn't seen, this kind of work it's particularly not in London before. Canova visits in 1815 specifically to see these marbles. And after he gets back to Italy, he writes to Lord Elgin himself, and he says, "Permit me to express the sense of great satisfaction which I have received from having seen in London the valuable antique marbles which you have brought hither from Greece. I think that I can never see them often enough. I admire in them the truth of nature united to the choice of the finest forms. Everything here breathes life, with a veracity, with an exquisite knowledge of art, but without the least ostentation or parade of it, which is concealed by consummate mastery and skill. The naked is perfect flesh and the most beautiful of its kind." It's interesting because he is talking about the ideal, and a very simplistic understanding during his moment about antiquity was that it was perfect. It was completely perfect. Canova looked a little deeper, and what he saw was this incredible bringing together of idealism and truth to reality. And, the idea of saying this most perfect flesh, to even say the word flesh in relation to these sculptures is really fascinating, I think. And the British government attempted to commission Canova to come back and restore the Parthenon marbles. And he said that it would be sacrilege for any man to touch them with a chisel, which, as Lisa has been saying, is precisely the opposite of the way that antiquities had been dealt with previously, and really anticipates our modern way of dealing with preservation and conservation in museums today.
I will say, before we move on, something that I just thought of is I have spent a lot of time looking at Greek and Roman sculptures, and I have spent quite a bit of time looking at Parthenon marbles, whether they're pedimental sculptures or the frieze or the metopes. They are not all equal. Some of them are bad. There is one where it's a battle with centaurs, and the guy, is being murdered by a centaur, but he kind of looks like he's dancing. So it's important to remember that Canova is also existing in a time when, like, Winkelmann is writing about antiquity, and people are making judgments based on a smaller sample size than we have today. And you do have this very flowery language, and we'll be talking about the Belvedere Apollo in a few minutes. But I just want to point out that these are just opinions, and they are opinions that have carried great weight for several centuries, but not all ancient Greek and Roman sculpture is perfection, is ideal, is perfect. I mean, there's a lot of bad sculpture out there.
No, it's funny, but it's true, because we talk about antiquity right tonight even as if it's one single thing, and it's not. And I think the example of the Parthenon marbles is perfect, because the reason a lot of those metopes can be different is because that was a project that went on for decades. And so the style was evolving as different sculptors came on. It wasn't a single sculptor who did all of this.
Right. I mean, it's most closely associated with the sculptor Phidias. And I was just in Rome last week with my colleague, and one of the reasons for my trip was to see a show at the Capitoline Museum of Phidias. And the whole last room was practically dedicated to Canova. And I was reading the text panel. It was talking about how Canova was described as the Italic Phidias. And so this is a sculpture of, what does it say? Canova in the act of embracing a herm of Jupiter. And then this work on paper was also on view, where he's being crowned in this very sort of antique-inspired.
It's almost like an apotheosis scene.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was interesting. I don't know that I texted you because, I don't know what the time difference was, and I didn't want to wake you up. But I was taking all these pictures, and I thought how timely that we were doing this talk. just after my trip, and this relationship that even other artists really considered Canova like as a member of this sort of ancient artists club. They associated him with antiquity. I mean, it wasn't just, it wasn't just something that he did himself. His like compatriots and his colleagues also saw this in him.
I mean, he was the first artist, or the only artist of his time, for whom it was frequently said that he had not only equaled the ancients, he had surpassed them, which is a really tall order. I mean, that is a huge thing to say about an artist, given the reverence for antiquity and given the place of antiquity, the central place of antiquity within the very definitions of beauty and idealism at that point in time. Canova, I love telling this just as a little sort of segue, but Canova, he was virtually a saint when he died. So much so that his body parts were taken as relics. So his heart was taken out and it was placed in the Accademia in Venice. His right hand was chopped off and placed in a tomb in the Frari, a tomb monument in the Frari in Venice. And then the rest of the body was interred in his chosen burial place in Venice. So there were literal relics being taken of this man's body, which I'm not sure if that had happened for much since the medieval era.
If he was a righty or a lefty, I mean, maybe they cut off the wrong hand.
That's true. True. I'll have to look at some more portraits.
But we thought we'd go through just a couple of case studies where we can sort of show you the ancient inspiration to Canova's modern masterpiece. And so we're starting with the Apollo Belvedere. This is the sculpture of Apollo that is located in the Belvedere courtyard of the Vatican. And it is, I think it's discovered in the 16th century and sort of moved immediately by one of the popes. There's so many, it's hard to keep track. Maybe Julius II, into the Belvedere courtyard. And this is the sculpture that Winkelmann describes as the ideal. Now, again, remember, that is one guy's opinion. It's a very nice sculpture. Do I think it is the best sculpture I have ever seen? Perhaps not. But it's very nice. But what it is it's very famous. Starting in the 1500s, it is incredibly, incredibly famous. And it serves as an inspiration to Canova, and I just love this picture.
I mean, it shows that this what you're seeing on the right is a print that had already been made of the Apollo Belvedere. And Canova obviously owned this print, and then he proceeded to inscribe it with all the measurements of all the little, the distance between elbow and wrist, the width of a wrist or a thigh. And this is the level at which people were really investigating antiquity. The problem was that a lot of artists really thought that these were rules, and so what they were coming up with in their own work were quite stiff things. I've said this before, but Canova, he understood the rules, but they were less important to him than the life of the ancient sculptures that he'd seen. And I think his statement about the Parthenon marbles is indicative of the way he's looking for the life in the sculptures.
Well, and I think that is really important. That's a really important statement. Remember that moment that Emerson just said, because he's taking these measurements, but remember, he's working 200 years after this sculpture has been unearthed and been restored. So some of these measurements are essentially modern measurements. The arms are both restored and added. And so I think in many ways, the fact that he didn't look at these as like hard and fast rules allowed him to not be restrained by actually incorrect proportions. And I actually have a funny story coming up about fingers and restorations.
The other thing is with, what most sculptors, Rome was the capital of art at this point in time. And the majority of sculptors, contemporary sculptors working in Rome at that time, were not necessarily making a living off their own inventions or creations. Their chief day-to-day business was restoring antiquities for private clients. Canova was much more interested in creating his own sculptures. So, even when he is looking to a precedent, it's never a copy. He reimagines the composition as something more in line with his own creative impulses.
Yeah, I love this juxtaposition where you can clearly see the inspiration, but it's not this sort of robotic copy or imitation. It really is more of an inspiration.
And I adore this work because there are two versions. There's one at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which I think is actually the one pictured here. And then there's the one at the Vatican. And the one at the Vatican was purchased specifically as a replacement for the Belvedere after Napoleon had looted it. And so they wanted to fill the same niche with something specifically by a contemporary Italian artist as a kind of a middle finger to Napoleon in a way, in order to champion a kind of nationalistic tradition of making art in Italy. And, what's so remarkable, there are many remarkable things about this sculpture. How is it even structurally sound? But this Canova's working in a new museological world. This is a world of museums and of things that are artworks that have the sort of the conceptual capacity of art. And so there is something so gloriously self-reflexive about this sculpture. This is Perseus, who has slain the Gorgon Medusa. He's holding aloft her head. And in most versions of the story, he could only look at her via his shield, because the reflection in his shield, because her gaze turned anyone to stone. And here he is looking straight at her, and he is a stone sculpture. I mean, it is Canova. He knew exactly what he was doing. This is an artwork that's telling you that it's an artwork, and that is so incredibly modern, I think.
And continuing on the Napoleon train, so similar to the Apollo Belvedere, the Medici Venus was another one of the sculptures looted by Napoleon and taken back to Paris. And in a similar vein, he was asked to replace the Medici Venus, and he created something quite different. And so before we unveil that, just to give you a little bit of context about the Venus sculpture, she's fully nude, and we know that this means that she is a goddess, because regular women, even imperial women, women of extremely elite status, were not typically depicted in the nude. Just so you know, the base that she's sitting on, that she's standing on, with the inscription is not the original base. So it's a different base she's put onto this separate base. And her arms and her fingers are restored. And the story about the fingers, at some point when they were looking at the restorations, a couple centuries later, they looked at the taper of the fingers and were like, there's something wrong with the taper of the fingers. They can't possibly be ancient. Now, I don't know how you know what ancient fingers look like and whether they're fat fingers or skinny fingers or they taper. I don't know, but there is like a whole kerfuffle about how her fingers were restored and restored badly because the fingers tapered.
So, we skip forward a couple of centuries, and, Napoleon's on his, looting terrorist, trip through Europe, and he wants the Medici Venus. And so it's taken. And so Ludovico I, the king of Etruria, he asked Canova to make a copy of it to go in the place in which it was traditionally housed. And Canova says absolutely not. And because he wants to do his own work. And so he creates a kind of, he riffs on the idea of the Medici Venus, and he creates his own Venus, which becomes called the Venus Italica, the Italian Venus, which I just love because there's again this kind of nationalistic impulse to it. And I think that you'll see that they are vastly different. The Venus de Medici, she is a real goddess. I mean, and she's completely nude. She's frankly only half-heartedly covering up.
Yeah, she's not. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, she's not making a great effort because she's a goddess. And, if a mortal lays eyes on a goddess, like you go boom, it's not really safe for you. So she's not really trying to hide much.
Whereas Canova's Venus, she seems caught in this instant of time where she's suddenly turned and seen someone's entered the room or someone's come into her line of sight, and she's rapidly, and sort of not very well, frankly, trying to cover herself up. And this is we were talking about this earlier. The idea of the drapery here only enhances her sense of nakedness, as opposed to the nudity of the Medici Venus. And in fact, one of Canova's contemporaries, the Italian poet Ugo Foscolo, he wrote, "I sighed with 1,000 desires, for really, if the Medici Venus is a most beautiful goddess, this is a most beautiful woman." Which I think just is so perfect. And, again, this is a modern, self-reflexive work of art. This is another work, like the Perseus and the Gorgon, that is talking specifically about the conditions of viewing art itself. She is aware that she's being looked at. And I think that these are ideas that then will become, will continue to be interrogated by artists, Manet, Olympia, all of these people. And Canova, I think, was really making us think about that in, 1804.
And I think, actually, if we go to the next one, I think you see a similar thing at work with the Three Graces, where there is something very, I wouldn't say stiff, because I actually think the antiquity is very beautifully sculpted, but it's very distant. There's a separation between you and the subject matter. Whereas when you look at Canova, he's completely changed the arrangement. The ancient version of the Three Graces is always very flat, and you see it. Even though this is a three-dimensional freestanding sculpture that can be viewed in the round, it still has a very flat sort of scheme to it. And Canova really he creates this triangular composition where these sisters who are bestowing their gifts, their graces, are actually, there's affection between them in a way that you really don't get that from the ancient version.
And instead of being sort of flat, as you said, almost like reliefs, he bookends the two sisters so that they're turning in towards each other. They're engaging with each other in a way which seems sort of natural or normal. They are not pure design repetitions.
Yeah.
They are real people who are engaging in a unique or idiosyncratic way. It's a really good example, I think, of how he is approaching sort of a new iteration of what classicism can be based on looking at the antique.
And then should we move on to Madame Mère?
We wanted to end with a marble that's in the exhibition, and we've been so thrilled to have this marble travel from Chatsworth, from the collection of the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, for the first time since they bought it at a Napoleonic fire sale in 1818. And so Letizia, it's a portrait of Letizia Bonaparte, who is the mother of Napoleon. And she apparently was quite a woman, and she visited Rome in 1804 and commissioned for herself a life-sized portrait from Canova. And he spent a number of years making it. And it was shipped to Paris in 1807. It was shown at the Paris Salon, where it received great acclaim. I don't think anyone said anything bad about it. Well, probably because he was the emperor at the time, and and she was a scary woman. But in the process of producing this portrait, he found himself again looking at the example of the antique.
Yeah, so the seated woman on, I'm backwards,
Left.
right? Left. Thank you. The seated woman at the left is a sculpture that's at the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And it has an interesting history of attribution. So it seems that when Canova was working, it was called Agrippina, and there are several Agrippinas in the Julio-Claudian family tree. And for those of you who have read Robert Graves or watched I, Claudius, you might remember that the Julio-Claudians are a tiny bit dysfunctional. And so Agrippina also is the mother of Nero, who is the emperor who is famous for letting Rome burn. And just also being kind of crazy. And also, by the way, he murdered his mother, Agrippina. So that was the attribution that I think was sort of going around at the time that Canova was working. It has since been reattributed to Helena, mother of Constantine, but I think that's also, sure, maybe not. The Agrippina attribution is quite interesting because when you go to the Capitoline, there are in fact not that many portraits of imperial women, full stop. And there really are even fewer portraits of Julio-Claudian imperial women. And when you look at the Julio-Claudian family tree, really, all of the women are sort of overshadowed by Livia. And so the scale of this sculpture, the pose of this sculpture, there are very, very, very few sculptures of seated women, seated Roman matrons like this. It's odd. Like, why Agrippina, of all of the Julio-Claudians, why would she get this kind of sculpture? And we think that the type is based on Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, who is a Republican era woman who was thought to be sort of the model Roman matron. And then somehow she gets attributed as Agrippina, and then now as Helena, like I said, mother of Constantine. But I haven't studied this sculpture super carefully, but if I remember correctly, the head, remember the theme of this, the head is not original to the body. And so here again, we have this restoration, and this is what's serving as the inspiration. And so you wonder how much of Agrippina he had in mind, or just besides just the form.
And various arguments. This is a very interesting question because many arguments have been made about this, based on the fact that people at the time generally thought that his model was this sculpture, which was, they thought then, a portrait of Agrippina, because of course, it's hard not to make the connection that, somehow Agrippina gave birth to Nero, and this woman has given birth to somebody equally crazy, and terrifying. And so the argument has been made that Canova is using this antique model for political purposes. And I'm not entirely of the view that that is correct. The Napoleonic family were massive patrons of Canova, and he couldn't survive, frankly, without their investment in him. So so firstly, just on that level, I seriously doubt. But that didn't stop other people at the time from probably thinking it quietly. But the other thing that sort of that makes a difference for me is the fact that this is a very warm portrait that he's produced of this woman. It is sensitive, and he hasn't depicted her in a way which suggests that he felt any particularly bad feelings towards her. It's a beautiful, beautiful sculpture where he is really drawn on this sort of pose of the hand coming up on the arm of the chair. You see, it's a little more graceful, frankly, a little more fluid than the what was thought to be the portrait of Agrippina. And I love the way the Madame Mère has being turned to look out toward the viewer. There's this sort of sense of casual majesty, I think, that's being given here. And a really great story about this once it was shown in Paris was that, Letizia was so happy with this sculpture that she told Napoleon, her son, she said, well, I know where it's going to go. And he was like, where? And she said, well, it's going to go opposite your throne in the Tuileries. And I have to be careful because my mother's here. But, and Napoleon said, bugger off, because he didn't want his mother looking at him, judging him every day. So he said, you know where it's going to go? It's going to go in storage, which is where it went. So Canova's great masterpiece ended up, in the basement, essentially.
I know.
And then, God, horror of all horrors, some English people bought it. And Letizia, I think that really drove her around off the edge.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. If you haven't been into the exhibition, Madame Mère really just knocks your socks off. She's right there in the middle, along with several of the clay sketches.
It is the perfect example of, not only his relationship with antiquity, but also his extraordinary technique.
Yeah.
Nobody could carve like this man in his lifetime. And this is a perfectly preserved sculpture that allows you to see what was such a big deal about the way that he finished the surface of a marble.
Yeah, and I think with that, we're at time.
Yeah.
And so we have left time for questions. And so we request that you raise your hand and someone will bring a mic to you. Although, am I using the mic that you were supposed to?
No, we have mics.
Okay.
We have additional ones. Don't
Sorry,
worry.
I can't see. Are there questions? Oh, great. Okay, someone.
I have a question right here.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I came from D.C., Washington, D.C., come to see several of the exhibition. At first, I thought I already saw this exhibition. I don't need to see it. When I walk in, I said, wow, this is a completely different exhibition. It's so spacious, and the design of it is so fabulous. It's much better. I hate to say that. It's much better than the one I saw in D.C.
That's very kind. Thank you. We were very... We were blessed to have a larger space to work in, and one of the great joys of doing this is that I think we've opened the windows in Regenstein at the back with artworks in the room for the first time in 35 years. And you can do that with sculpture because you don't have the same lighting restrictions that you do with paintings and drawings. So that has been a joy, and also to be able to look through the colonnade and then out into a path of trees and garden. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
We did not plant that comment, by the way.
I'm looking at my mother.
I'm speaking of plants. I just wondered what materials they used
to create the tints? You know, were they natural dyes? Or were they stones? What was, if you know?
There's a little work being done on the tinting, this sort of yellowish tinting that he would sometimes give the flesh of his sculptures. And all I can remember is that there was horse urine in some capacity involved. So they're using these sort of natural materials, and of which that was apparently favored.
Marigold, horse urine. I mean, for the antiquities, they're using ochres, Egyptian blue, so a lot of minerals. What we have a lot of questions about for the ancient sculptures is what the binder was, because you can't just like crush up ochre and then slap it on marble and have it stick. So were they using, what kind of gum were they using? Were they using tempera or egg or something like that? Any other questions?
We have one back here.
Hello. I was wondering, sometimes his heads are much larger than his original subjects. Were they intended to be seen from a height?
Canova's sculptures? Yes, I mean, there are a number of works that were designed on a colossal scale. I mean, we're talking 4-meter high figures. And particularly his two great monuments to deceased popes in Rome, one in Santi Apostoli and one in St. Peter's. And the main figure, which is the portrait of that deceased pope, is in both monuments seated on a throne, but the throne is above a gigantic doorway. And in his earliest monument, my favorite, to Pope Clement XIV, he reaches his arm out like this. And so you're looking up at this figure who is stretching out his hand over you, either in blessing or condemnation, depending on how guilty you're feeling, I guess, about what you've been up to. But so that does require, and this was going on in the Renaissance as well with sculptors. I mean, they had to adjust their proportions depending on how far away from the viewer the works were and at what angle the viewers would be looking to see the works. So these sculptors are always making slight adjustments for aesthetic and aesthetic reasons.
So actually, I do have a couple of questions related to what I just commented on. I'm a docent at the Smithsonian, so when I go to an exhibition, I always look for curations. So my questions are 2 or 3, maybe. One is the wall, we call the wall label. Are those the same as what we would see in the DC exhibition, or you designed a completely different, right?
So for our show, for our presentation of the show, we employed something that has been done here at the museum once or twice before, and I thought it was brilliantly done. And so we have short introductory introductions to each gallery, but they're very short, and because really what we're dealing with, the way that the objects are arranged in the galleries are thematically by subject matter, for the most part. And so we didn't feel that needed that much explaining. But what did need explaining, and what was integral to our presentation here, was the idea of process. How do you get from A to B? How do you start with an idea about a sculpture and end somehow with this finished perfect marble, and often on a very large scale? And so we employed this large panels that we called gateway texts. They're gateways to ideas and to individual objects. So each gateway text is paired with a single object, and through that object we discuss a particular concept or material that's crucial for understanding process. So clay, sketch, model, scale, workshop, and things like that. So that felt like, for a process-based way, a really nice way of leading people through, while also directing them to specifically think about those ideas in relation to individual objects.
So that actually lead to a comment. I noticed some of the title of the gallery, you put it very up high, and the wall label, you put it very low, but the whole thing is so tall. It's so elegant. It's just, I haven't seen exhibition like that. Of course, you have the luxury of this very tall hall. So my second question is related to light. The lighting is absolutely gorgeous.
I was blessed because I asked for and was graciously allowed to invite or bring a lighting designer to the museum to light the exhibition. She's someone I worked with on my very first show at the Frick in 2013. Her name's Anita Jorgensen. She's based in New York, and she does a number of East Coast museum exhibitions, and she is a true artist. And I think that lighting is so crucial, especially for sculptures, because they cast shadows, because you see them in the round. And to watch this, to watch Anita spend 2 days with her team lighting the show was one of the most interesting and experiences in my career, because these people are real artists. And she would start almost with no lights at all in the galleries, and then they would just come on one at a time. She tries to use as few lights as possible for each work, to have as little shadow as possible, and where there are shadows, they are symmetrical. I mean, it's unbelievable, and it makes the objects live up to their potential.
I mean, it's really remarkable, having just been in Rome and just been at the Vatican, where things are dusty and dirty and there are no labels, and they're on, 3 rows of shelves, and there's the lights are out, and I'm holding my iPhone flashlight and giving it to my husband, who's a foot taller, and you really, the contrast is incredible, and you really lose something with 3-dimensional objects and sculpture if they're not lit well. And so I think it's, Emerson, I think, has started a dangerous trend here at the Art Institute, because I certainly want to hire this lighting designer for my sculpture show.
Yeah, I think our accounting department is not going to be happy with me.
A little upset. I think we have time for one more question.
I was just wondering why we've never heard of him prior to this, so to speak. I don't think that he's a Michelangelo, you hear any of that kind of stuff. And I mean, his work is remarkable. So how did he fall out of favor?
So he was inordinately famous in his lifetime, and supported by all the great patrons of art, all the royal families in Europe. All the critics wrote about him endlessly. And I think the stylistic preferences changed, within 10 years of his death. Because suddenly Romanticism appeared on the scene. And the Romantics thought that Neoclassicism was frigid and cold. I think even today there are some people, and even people I've walked through the exhibition, they say, oh, we much prefer the works in clay. The marbles are, they're cold. And it's only after you direct them to start looking very carefully at the marbles that you start to realize that they're very, very sensual works and very fleshy in many cases. The Neoclassicism has gone in and out of favor. And of course, in the 20th century, Neoclassicism became problematic because of its extensive use by fascists. But in Italy, Canova is still, the be-all and end-all. And there were huge celebrations all of last year, which was the bicentenary of his death. But I think right now in art history there is a real return to interest in neoclassicism. I think that there's also this wonderful connections between Canova's carefully produced, perfect, idealized women with contemporary technologies that you have on your phone to tweak your face to make it look perfect, and to, a face tune or whatever it's called.
We need a Canova filter.
We have contemporary Canova filters today, and there's this kind of way in which a lot of people try to make themselves look, almost surreally perfect. So I think he does have a kind of relevance in that way today as well. And he's also extremely relevant today because of his workshop practices. He was so in demand that he had to evolve this gigantic studio in which tasks were split up almost like a factory production line. He's not terribly different to Jeff Koons in that respect, for example. Someone took the plaster cast for him. A specialist did the initial carving of the work for him. Canova was there mostly with his hands at the beginning with his clay sketches, and at the end when he laboriously finished the surfaces of the marbles. But it's this separation of tasks in a workshop situation that also, is part of the development of capitalism, I think, as well.
Are we?
One more.
Yeah,
yes.
one more. Okay. Yeah.
Don't you think he was affected by Michelangelo as a sculptor and then Bernini?
The question was Canova affected by Michelangelo and Bernini? I think there was probably some interest. Canova would have been aware of both artists' works intimately, especially Bernini in Rome. But I think that Michelangelo goes a little too far for him, a little too extreme in musculature perhaps, but I do think he was interested. Bernini, I think, was probably, Canova thought of him as the antithesis of what he wanted to do. I mean, he would have seen it as being too over the top, too Baroque, which, is just what it was. There was, with Bernini, there's no integrity to the marble block. If something falls off, he sticks it back on. I think Canova, like Michelangelo, was really invested in the integrity of the single block of stone. And also, I don't think for him there would have been a sense of play acting as opposed to, truth to nature. Although, of course, there are moments in Bernini when you just cannot believe it's not real flesh. And then there are moments in Canova where he can be a little too ideal. So it was definitely Canova the neoclassicist trying to distance himself from the reigning art form and style, epitomized by Bernini that had come before him. It's sort of, rebelling against one's father or something, I guess. Okay.
All right.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much.